Welcome, everybody, to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week on the show, we've got an episode dedicated to the Arena Open, which is happening on Saturday and Sunday this weekend. The format is sealed on day one, draft on day two. So we're going to do an episode focused mostly on sealed. Building sealed pools, playing sealed pools. It tends to be a muscle that's a bit underflexed, I find, right? Because most of the time when people are playing sealed, it's during their pre-release or once a set release cycle for these competitive events. So I want to walk through a bit of my approach to sealed in general and also some Brother Wars specific, of course. I've done about 10 sealed events so far, built maybe 20 pools through coaching sessions as well, 20 additional pools. And also in preparation for this episode, I reached out to Charlie Schaefer and Carl, aka Strix Familiar and Two Duct Cube. If you're not familiar with those two, I've had them both on the show before. Charlie is an excellent sealed player. I would actually go back and I suggest you go back and listen to some of his sealed episodes because he has some really good advice. And Carl, of course, Two Duct Cube, half of the Mystical Dispute podcast. I reached out to them specifically because they both met in the finals recently of a sealed paper RCQ tournament. So I want to shout them out before we jump in. As two players that are very, very good at what they do and have had some recent success in this format, and they contributed some thoughts to this episode. So before we get into that, of course, I want to quickly shout out the Patreon. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you want to support the show, if you like what we're doing here, if you feel like you've gotten something out of the show, feel free, check it out, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Of course, there's also a bunch of reward tiers over there that you give back to us. We want to give back to you. All the reward tiers over there are dedicated, pointed towards getting you better at Limited in some way, in some fashion, whether it be the entry level, which gets you into the secret channels of the Limited Level Ups Discord, which, by the way, I should shout out, I don't shout this out often enough, bit.ly/join the Discord if you want to type that into your search bar, or it's in the show notes of this podcast and anything I put out. Check that out. It's a great place to get better at Limited Magic. A lot of really, really smart people over there. There are secret channels over there that you get direct access to me if you want to send me your decks or your draft logs for review. There's also coaching tiers, Cordo Coach classroom tiers, the Cordo classes I do bi-weekly where you can come meet with a bunch of really smart people. We talk our thoughts in the format, and yeah, check that out. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. All right, so let's dive into this. So like I mentioned, I do want to start off by talking about some of my general sealed tips, some rules of engagement, if you will, for the format before we get into some Brother Wars specifics. I do think that Brothers War is fairly straightforward as far as sealed formats go. For those who know what a straightforward sealed format entails, but for those that maybe aren't as familiar with what a sealed format, a normal sealed format is, let's cover some of the bases. So my big picture approach to sealed hinges on two big picture points. And anytime anybody asks me for pre-release sealed tips, this is what I tell them. Two rules. One, my first rule, and this is the big one that I've heard quoted a bunch, and I don't even know if I actually came up with this, but this is the phrase I use. It's play the good cards and don't play the bad cards. And it's so funny. It's so obvious, but let me get into this a little bit. So each sealed pool has a certain level of potential in it, right? A certain level of raw power, a handful of cards that you can point to and you go, these are great cards. And your goal is you want to harness as much of that power as you possibly can, which means finding a way to get as many of those good cards into your deck as possible. If you're looking at a sealed pool as a puzzle, the puzzle that you're trying to solve in most sealed formats, Brothers War included here, is how do I fit in the most good, strong cards into my deck while not destroying my mana base? You're finding responsible ways to splash. Unless you're lucky and all of your good cards happen to be focused in two colors, your bombs are in two colors, your good playables, your removal are in just black and white, let's say. Most often, this means, if you're going to get all the good cards in, you're going to be 2 colors in a splash, 2.5 colors, which is like 2 colors and maybe splashing 3 or 4 cards, 2 colors and 2 splashes potentially. And this is especially true in a format like this one, where there are a lot of pretty good ways to splash pretty easily. Splash a card or 2. Chromatic Star, Elsewhere Flask, Energy Refractor, Evolving Wild. There's a lot of tools in this set to just splash some splashable bombs, basically. At the end of my build, I want to leave, one of my goals is to leave as few good cards in the sideboard as possible. So That's the play your good cards half of this rule. But the second part of don't play the bad cards is equally important. When I was playing games of Sealed this week on Arena, I think one of the biggest reasons that I won games was because my opponents just had a lot of bad cards in their decks. And now Arena Sealed, the queues are not always filled with the highest caliber of competition, I will admit. But I think even amongst more experienced players, one of the biggest pitfalls for Sealed is just having a handful of very low impact or just bad cards in their deck. And it's not like their whole deck is bad cards, but maybe like 5 or 6 cards that they're just like, okay, these are the filler cards, I'll put in at the end. And I'm not talking about unplayables. I'm not talking like Thran Power Suits or Fog of War. I'm talking like stuff like Philology Chain Dancer, which is like the 2/4 double strike. Pay 2 mana, give it double strike. Stuff like Mishra's Onslaught, which is like the 4 mana, make 2 tokens or pump your team. Killzone Acrobat, the 3 mana 3/2 that you can sack something, give it flying. I can construct a deck where those cards I just mentioned are playable cards, but in your average Seal deck, they're just not going to be very good. They're not very high impact cards. I think the reason that people end up playing these kind of bad cards is because the advice you hear often when people are talking about Sealed is let your rares guide you. Like I just said, play your good cards, right? And, you've got a blue bomb, a black bomb. You really want to play those cards. And I think that's a really good sentiment to internalize. But I think what happens is this slightly misleads people sometimes. And what will happen is you look at your pile and you go, okay, I've got a great black mythic, a great blue mythic. You put those in and you're like, all right, well, I'll just fill the rest of the deck out with blue and black commons. You hear this very often. People open up their Sealed packs or pre-release and like, well, I guess I'm blue, right? Like that's like a very common thing that you hear. And what that leads to a lot of the time is people not, I think they underestimate the gravity of putting 6, 7, 8 kind of filler cards in their deck, bad filler cards to accommodate their bombs. What you're going to want to do instead is find a configuration in your deck that can play those awesome cards while not having to play too much bad filler. So for example, you have a Saheeli, Filigree Master, which is the blue-red Planeswalker. Instead of being like, well, I've got a Saheeli, I'm blue-red, maybe you splash Saheeli, because maybe your blue base is not very good, right? Maybe your red base is very good. Instead of having to play bad filler cards in red, you play blue-green, and then you splash the red. That's a much better way to do it. A way you can maybe shortcut this or make it a little bit easier in the build process is find your two, either your best color, your deepest color, or the color with your best cards in it, and maybe pair those together, right? You're going, all right, well, my blue is really, really deep. It gives me a lot of good commons and uncommons, and my green has a lot of bombs. It's got like a Titania's Command or something, So that's a good pairing, because you're not going to have too many bad cards in your deck. You get to play the best of both worlds, all your good cards. Of course, this could also just be splashing, right? Just like splashing 2 to 3 colors to get all, like you've got a good base in black and blue, and you splash a red card and a white card. You can totally do that. So that's my first rule, right? Play the good cards, don't play the bad cards. My second rule is don't play too many bad or filler or low impact 2-drops. So in Sealed, it's really, really, really important that all of the cards in your deck are good at most points in the game. Games tend to go long, and you can't really afford to be drawing your Atomical Honor Guard, which is the 2 mana 3/1, on turn 10. Because your good opponents are going to be drawing impactful cards, and you're drawing your crappy 2-drop that isn't very good past turn, 2 or 3. This is a bit different in Brothers War than in most sets, though, because actually I think there are a higher number of good playable 2-drops that are good in the late game in the set. Stuff like Scrapwork Mutt, stuff like Argothian Sprite, which is the 2 mana 2/2 in green that you can pay 7 mana to put 2 counters on it. Like, that's still good in the late game. Even something like Air Marshal, 2 mana, 1 in the blue, 2/1, 3, give a soldier flying. Like, that's a card that has impact in the late game. And actually, it's kind of funny. Air Marshal is a card I'm more willing to play in Sealed than in Draft, because in Draft, you actually don't really have time often to activate this ability. In Sealed, it's a 2-drop. You can do something with your mana early, and then you draw it later. It's also still pretty good. So what you really, really want to be careful of, I've talked in the past about caring too much about the aesthetic of your curve rather than the actual strategic implications of what your curve is doing. Because I think too often people go, oh, I need to fill out my curve, right, to make sure I don't die early. And it looks nice to have a really filled out 2-drop slot. I think in Sealed, because you're just going to face aggro less often, that's just a truth about Sealed, because you can't draft all the 2-drops in the world. Most people's pools are not going to be super conducive to aggro decks. You don't need to have 8 2-drops or 7 2-drops like I normally suggest for this draft format. You need somewhere more in the range of like 4 or 5 or 3. Even 3 is kind of okay. Until, like, if you're below 3 or 4, then maybe you have to play something crappy like Atomical Honor Guard, right? 2 mana, 3/1. But until you get to that range, like, just don't overload your deck with too many bad cheap filler cards for the sake of your curve, because it is more important to have high impact cards than it is to have a perfect curve. That's the trade-off you're making there. So yeah, if you are wondering what the difference between a low impact and a high impact 2-drop is, like, just ask yourself, hey, would I look at your card and be like, am I happy to draw this card on turn 10 of the game? If it's something like a Thraxodemon, black 2-drop that you can sack something, draw a card, you sack your Power Stones later, yeah, of course you're happy. You're also pretty okay playing that on turn 2. This isn't to say that you shouldn't play stuff on turn 2. You certainly should. Like, it's good to have something on turn 2. It's just not as critical as it is in the draft format. That's all it comes down to. All right, so some more just classic sealed tips. Games are a tick slower. Cards that are slightly too slow in draft get a little bit better in sealed. I will warn, though, because whenever I do a sealed episode, I always bring up this point. Don't assume sealed is so much slower than draft, because I know personally for myself, when I started playing sealed compared to, after I drafted a bit, when I was first learning, I was like, oh, I hear sealed is slower. Like, I heard the good players say sealed is slower. And I really pushed in the direction of slow, no 2-drops, no early game. You can't do that, because people are still going to play the good 2-drops, right? Like, they're 2/2 menace creatures, and there are Argothian sprites. And if your opponents play those on 2, you can't just do nothing, right? But at the same time, like I said, you do have a little bit more breathing room. So some stuff that does get a little bit better in sealed, Hand Disruption. So something like Gix's Caress, which is a good card in draft. I like this card in draft, but gets even better in sealed when you're gonna snipe your opponent's bombs. This is the 3 mana, look at your opponent's hand, you take an online card, that player discards it, you make a Power Stone. Counter spells, Urza's Rebuff, just a little bit too slow for draft, not a card I really want, but when Urza's Rebuff is countering a Titania's command, that's pretty good. And because you're going to face more rares in general in sealed than you do in draft, because people get 6-packs, not 3, Urza's Rebuff is going to have some high-value targets. Flyers, something like Koilos Rock, 5 mana, 3/3 flash flyer, make a Power Stone. Another card that's like a little bit too slow for draft. I'm not like sad if this card is in my deck, but it's not a premium card. Anything with flying does break stalls. It makes it so that you have some sort of inevitability. It's a threat your opponent has to remove. So even if this card isn't bringing you home, it's not just like, oh man, this card is going to completely break open this stall. It does make your opponent use removal spells, which is a really underrated aspect of why flyers are good. And then, because you're taxing your opponent's removal spells, you can then save your bombs and play them after your opponent has used the removal spells. So card draw, counter spells, Hand Disruption. Those are the big ones. Oh, so flying too. Those are the big things that are often a little bit better in sealed than in draft. All right, another thing I often think about in sealed is this spectrum of streamlined versus good card decks. And what I mean by this is there are decks that you'll open, there are pools that you'll open that have pretty streamlined decks or cards that push you towards streamlined strategies. You open a pool with 3 Goblin Blast Runners, which, right, the 1 mana 1/2 that gets +1 and +2 in menace when you sacrifice a permanent. That's a card in draft that's great. You can build around that. You can pick up sacrifice synergies. But in sealed, you don't always have the luxury of opening those sacrifice synergies naturally. One thing I'll say, though, is if you have 3 Goblin Blast Runners, I might push a little bit towards going like, okay, I've got the package for a streamlined deck with synergy, heavy synergies, so I'll play something like, a Thraxodemon a little more readily. I was talking about how Thraxodemon is a little bit better in sealed. It gets even a little more better if you have sacrifice synergies. Really, my point here is you want to not worry about synergy too much, right? Sometimes you'll open those really streamlined pools where you've got that perfect sacrifice deck, or you've got that perfect blue-black draw 2 deck where you've got 2 of the Evangels of Synthesis. I think a trap that you might fall into is going, oh, I opened up some, a signpost uncommon, like 1 Evangel of Synthesis, and then you put in like curates and stuff to enable that just isn't very good. The same thing goes with the Blast Runners, where you've got 3 Blast Runners, but maybe you don't have like that many sacrifice triggers. It might just be right to leave them out, right? Because in general, synergies don't come together that often in your sealed pools, but look for the times they do, right? The other side of the spectrum is the good card spectrum, where you don't care too much about like synergies, making your Blast Runners work, making your draw 2 synergies work, making your graveyard synergies work. You're just like, I'm just shoving all the good cards in my deck. And that often happens when, 1, you don't have the cards that push you towards a certain synergy, like the Blast Runners, or you don't have the payoffs for the Blast Runners. 2, when you have a bunch of fixing. If you've got a bunch of Evolving Wilds and a Burnished Heart and a Chromatic Stars, that pushes me a little bit more towards just like, put all my good cards in my deck, don't worry about the interactions between my cards, I'm just going to be casting great cards every turn of the game. It doesn't matter too much how they interact with each other because they're just going to be powerful cards. So when you're opening your sealed pool, give yourself a little bit of a check. Be like, okay, what cards push me towards a certain synergy? Whether it be Sacrifice or Draw 2 or Soldiers, do I have enough cards to support that? And if not, you probably want to push a little bit towards the good card side of the spectrum. Because the danger, of course, is you get half-assed way through the synergy, right? You kind of like are like, okay, well, I've got a synergy pool, but I've only got half of the cards I would like. Like, if you look at a good synergy draft deck compared to a good synergy seal deck, your seal deck's not going to get there as often, right? So don't submit a deck that's like halfway there on synergy. If you're halfway there on synergy and it's not like almost a good-looking draft deck, just build good cards. Don't worry too much about playing kind of medium cards to enable your Blast Runners, for example. All right, let's move on to some bro specifics. So the rules of engagement here, I'm calling Codename Bro, and I got this from Charlie. Charlie sent this to me, and there's 3 big things that I am thinking about in this set. So the B for bro, B-R-O, is bombs, of course. So bombs are a huge part of every sealed format, but especially in this sealed format, the rares are very good, first and foremost. Like, there's just a lot of really good rares. But you're going to see a lot of rares in your sealed pool and also your opponent's sealed pool because there's more of them. Because of the retro artifact sheet, right? The retro artifact sheet makes it so that, you know, you'll maybe have an additional rare or 2 on average. Usually when I'm opening my sealed pools on Arena, it'll show you the 6 cards, and there's a little thing at the bottom that says, you've opened these cards and an additional 3 rares, right? So just, you know, first and foremost, get as many of those good cards into your deck as you can. And again, figure some way to get those good cards into your deck, even if they're not your main colors. Obviously, if you open up a Worm Coil Engine or a Cityscape Leveler, that's amazing, because it's colorless, it's going to go every single one of your decks. But what if you open up a Sky Strike Officer, which is the 2 and a blue, 2/3 flyer, when it attacks you make a soldier, tap 3 untap soldiers you control, draw a card, and your blue's not very good. Maybe you only have like 3 good playables in blue. Well, find a way to splash it, right? It's a single pipped card, it's only blue. It's not that hard to splash. If you have to play 2 islands to get it in there, and you don't have that much fixing, I would recommend that, right? I think that's actually pretty good. But, you know, there is a lot of fixing in this set, like the stars and the Evolving Wilds. You often don't have to stretch too far to be able to accommodate a bomb. And when I say a bomb, I don't even mean like one of the top 10 cards in the set. Something like Skyfisher Spider or Third Path Iconoclast, these like really, really good gold uncommons, or like one of the top tier commons. Like, find a way to get those cards into your deck. Once again, the best of the best cards, try to get them in, because that is the puzzle you're trying to solve. Also, stuff like, you know, In the Trenches, which is like a double pipped bomb. It's 1 white. Maybe, you know, it's a hard card to splash, but maybe you can configure your deck where, yeah, maybe white wasn't going to be your base color, but because you have this card, well, you're more willing to trade off a few better cards in green, let's say, as a base color, and instead play white as your base color to pair with, let's say, red as your other base color, because it lets you play your double pip bomb. So those are kind of the trade-offs you're making. Sometimes you do have those pools where it's like, white's got the bomb, but it's slightly less good as a color overall, but red has no bombs and it's slightly better. You make the concession to the bomb most of the time, I would say. Also, when you have a bomb that's like as good as something like Titania's Command or Gix's Command, even though that is double pipped, I think you should try and see if your pool supports fitting that in. So I've got a deck here. I actually just grabbed this off of the recent trophies on 17 lands. It's a red-white deck, and it's splashing, quote-unquote, Titania's Command, which is a double green card, but it's the best card in the set. The person, what they did is, they've got 2 Evolving Wilds, and a Brushland, and 2 Forests, and that's 5 sources, and that's under what you would want for a double-pipped bomb, or a double-pipped card in general, but I think that's doable and sealed because, 1, you just have a little bit more time. 2, you also often have cards that see more cards, and whenever you have cards that see more cards, card draw, stuff like Bitter Reunion, stuff like Mishra's Research Desk, that makes splashing a little bit more doable because you'll be able to find your sources a little bit more often. So the magnitude of your bomb certainly matters when you're figuring out what to shoehorn into your deck, right? I'm not just going to shoehorn every good double pips card. For example, this person also has a Visions of Phyrexia, which is the 2 red rare that you like exile a card at the top of from the top of your library at the beginning of your turn. You can play it. That's a card that's good, but I wouldn't shoehorn that in. I think that as long as you have like some amount of fixing and some amount of cards that can help you see other cards, I think you should stretch to play your Titania's commands, your Gix's commands, your best of the best cards in the set. All right, so the R for bro here is removal. And, this is pretty obvious too. This is a very core tenet of most sealed formats. But again, in Brothers War, I think it's even more exaggerated because, like I just mentioned, there's a lot of really, really good bombs that are must answers. So in some formats, in some sealed formats, you don't want to go too heavy on removal, right? You don't want to be like, every single removal spell in my pool, get it in there. But I think in this one, in this sealed format, you're not that sad if you just find a way to jam all your removal spells in. Because most of the games in this format come down to who can land a bomb, who can stick a bomb. And again, people have more bombs on average in this format in particular because of the retro artifact sheet. So obviously, you're going to be playing all your stuff like Overwhelming Remorse, your stuff like Power Stone Fracture. If you have these cards in your deck, consider black being your base color or splashing it somehow. But also, I'm much more willing to play a copy or even multiple copies of like the artifact and enchantment removal. Stuff like Raise to the Ground, which is the 2 and a red destroyed artifact. Or Shoot Down, which is the green version of this. Like, these kind of cards, which I'm like, okay, I'll play a copy of in my draft deck. I'm playing 2 or 3 artifact enchantment removal cards. I think that's totally reasonable because so many of the bombs are artifacts and enchantments. When I say shove all of the removal into your deck, I'm mostly talking about like the removal that is catch-all or not that conditional. And now you might say that Disenchant and Race to the Ground is conditional, but I think it hits enough of the important stuff. I'm talking more about like Disfigure. I wouldn't just jam all my Disfigures in, which is, 1 black mana, -2/-2. Like, that's a good card, but it's not like, oh man, I've got 3 Disfigures, shove them all in, because it doesn't deal with the cards you need to deal with most of the time. Like, yes, it'll snipe off the 2-drops, that's kind of nice, but I'm really talking about how you're getting rid of those 5/5s, how you're getting rid of those Cityscape levelers. That's what really you need to think about. And then the O here is optimize mana. So optimize your mana, which is really a fancy way of saying find ways to use mana each turn of the game that uses an O to fit the bro acronym. But really, this is just saying find mana sinks, find places to put your mana. The 2 most common ways you will lose in sealed is 1, if you can't answer a bomb, and we just covered that, or 2, your opponent has more stuff to do with their mana and you run out of stuff to do. I said the most common way that I won on Arena this week was my opponents playing bad cards, but definitely the second most common way that I won was my opponents just, going back to the 2-drop thing, played 2-drops that just didn't do anything in the late game and they ran out of stuff to do with their mana. They didn't have card draw, they didn't have mana sinks. I actually think this is a big picture point that applies to Draft 2 that I've kind of adopted in the past week of the format. My current understanding of this format has kind of more and more revolved around not just pure aggression and, the unearthed cards and all that stuff, but more like, how can I outspend my opponent on every single turn of the game, starting on turn 1? And that means, playing the good 1-drops, playing the 2-drops, and finding ways to use your mana as the games go on, which is why Unearthed is so good. But, that's neither here nor there. We're talking about Sealed. But in Sealed, what this means, of course, is all your Unearthed cards. Those are great, right? There's ways to use your mana. Especially the cheap Unearthed cards that I've been raving about in the last episode. Cohort and Combat Courier and Scrapwork Mutt. These are fantastic because they are just good cards, but they give you small increments of mana to work with, right? So that on turn 4, you can be like, okay, well, I sack my Combat Courier and play another 2-drop if that's what the game demands. Or you just like on turn 6 when you've run out of stuff to do, you go, okay, I unearth my Mutt, I loot a little bit, I get rid of this excess land, and I unearth my Cohort, I attack you. Like, that's all. You just want to keep spending mana every single turn, and my goal is just to never have a turn where I go, all right, pass the turn, and, I guess you go, I'll just wait to draw my good cards. I want to be doing stuff with my mana, even if I don't have my best cards at the time. Prototypes. Here's another interesting little quirk of Sealed. So, prototypes, which I'm going to get into in a second, just a little bit deeper, but I'm a little bit happier to get prototypes into my deck. Prototypes are a good way to spend mana on turn 3 and mana on turn 7. So stuff like Combat Thresher, Boulder Branch Golem, the good prototype cards. I am a little more willing to put those cards in my sealed deck for sure. Argothian Sprite, which is a card I mentioned before. 2-drops that scale with the game, like Mana Sinks. Really, it's just Mana Sinks. An Unearthed Prototype, and stuff like Mind's Eye, too. This is another good example of a card that's a little bit too slow for draft, which is the 5-mana Rotro artifact that says whenever your opponent draws a card, you can pay 1 and you can draw a card too. Like, another really good place to put your mana. And again, additional card draw is pretty good. Even stuff like Mishra and Urza, the uncommon Mishra and Urza, which are a little bit too slow for draft. You really don't want these, but they give you a lot of stuff to do with your mana. You can loot, but also you get rid of excess lands, which is really important. You dig to your bombs. Mishra and Urza are really playable cards in the sealed format, where I kind of don't really look at them for draft, to be honest. So just think of that, right? Just, again, if you're trying to evaluate what cards you want in your sealed deck, should I include this? Ask, does this allow me to sink mana into it? Does this give me something to do in the late game or in the mid game? And if not, you probably want to shy away from it, basically. Okay, so just to get a little bit deeper on prototypes here, I'm still not super high on prototypes in sealed, because the issue with them, that you play them for 8 mana and then they just die, that still happens, right? People are going to be playing a lot of removal. You tap out, you cast your Spotter Thopter, your opponent goes, all right, just kill that thing, right? Which, is not the worst exchange in the world. It's not like draft where they kill your thing and then they just attack you for lethal. But I do still think there is a cost. You don't want to just load up your deck with prototype cards. The difference between draft and sealed, though, is where if I had to choose between, I'm looking at cards 16 to 23, and I'm like, okay, I have to fill out my deck with some stuff. In draft, I would fill it those slots out with medium 2-drop, stuff like the Sky Hunter Rock, right? The 2-mana 3/1 reach, or the Tomical Honor Guard, like totally fine. Cards that are good against aggro. Here, I consider the kind of medium prototype cards as that's the good filler instead, right? Because it does let you spend all your mana in the late game, or let you spend your mana in the early game if you're missing some mana, while being impactful, right? Your opponent still is going to have to care about a Spotter Thopter. They can't just ignore it. Stuff like Boulder Branch Golem, stuff like Combat Thresher, the good prototype cards, obviously these are good too. Also, I'll say that if you're building and you're like a few cards short, like you're like, oh, my red-green deck is like 3 cards short of being really good, maybe you put a Spotter Thopter in. You can't even cast the blue mode. There's going to be a lot of times where you just have those chromatic stars and you're like, okay, I've got a blue source in my deck, and, if I can cast it on 4 and I have the mana, sure, I'll just do that. But sometimes I'll just play Spotter Thopter or any other of these expensive prototype creatures, even though I can't prototype them, as my kind of 23rd, 22nd playable. So that's something to consider too. All right, another big picture point for this format is red does get a little bit worse in sealed. One, obviously, because, the aggro decks don't come together as often. But two, the red aggro decks in this draft format are, I would say, pretty synergy based, where when you have your Blast Runners and your Pentagon Strongbulls, you do get to prioritize the Elsewhere Flasks, the Chromatic Stars, all the cards that play well with these, the cantripping artifacts, where you're not always going to get to do that in sealed. So the power of red is definitely diminished by a reasonable amount. And if you're used to drafting a bunch of red decks and killing with them, just like completely, trophying all the time, I would adjust my expectations. So when you open 3 Blast Runners, again, like I was talking about, when you're like looking to see if your pool is a little more streamlined and you have the synergy, sure, look for it. I'm just saying, don't just jam 3 Blast Runners in your deck. It's not going to work out as often as it does in draft. Now, the Pentagon Strongbull, that card I think is still quite good because it does do a lot of the good things I was just talking about. It's a cheap card that has impact in the late game, a place to put your mana. But just a general note that the red cards, because they are synergy based, each individual card does get slightly worse. I will say though, as much as I've been talking down aggro decks, it's not like they don't exist. You can definitely have a good aggro deck with, the Blast Runners or just a bunch of good 2s and maybe some good top end. I've got a black-red deck here that has double Blast Runner. It has double Misery's Shadow, which is the rare Shade 2-drop, which is obviously very lucky, but a bunch of other good 2-drops. Mishra Clean by Gix, which is the mythic Mishra. So, not to say that it can't happen, and I actually think in Brothers War Limited or Brothers War Sealed, it happens more often than it does in other sealed formats because this format has a lot of good aggro cards. Look out for your sealed decks that do have them and they're an option, but don't look at them as a default. I do think it's like a 30 or 20% of the time your pool has a good aggro deck, and then the other 70 or 80, you're just going to be playing most of just your most powerful cards. Exactly what I was just talking about before, fitting as many good cards in your deck as possible. Okay, pool layout. So this is kind of just a big picture tip for how I lay out my pool, because I think it's really important to lay out your pool in a way that gives you just a lay of the land so you can see what your important cards are. The number one thing I'm going to recommend to you if you are doing this on Arena is don't do it on Arena. sealeddeck.tech. And I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes and in the YouTube description if you want to check it out. sealeddeck.tech, if you haven't used this before, is a website that you can import your sealed pool from Arena, and it is such a better UI experience. You can see your pool, you can see all of the cards at once. They give you a lot of sorting, filtering options, sort by rarity, sort by color, and it's easy to drag and drop things. On Arena, it's just a nightmare. So this is my first part of advice here. What you do on Arena is you put all of your cards into your pool. You export the pool. So what you're gonna do if you're gonna go on your you're doing it on the day of, you add your cards to the pool. You back out, and there's gonna be a little thing on the part where you could enter a game where it says add this to your decks. Right? It adds it to your decks. You go to your decks on Arena. You export the deck. You copy paste what it gives you to sealeddeck.tech, and it just gives you your pool. Excellent way to look at your pool. I highly recommend it. When I lay out my pool, here's what I do. First thing I do, sort by rarity, and I drag all of the good cards into the pile. So like I was talking about at the top of this episode, you want to play your good cards, regardless of color. You're going to take, I would say, like the top 30 cards. The cards you're actively excited to play. Your rares, your good removal, your quality commons and uncommons. Put that into the main part of your build, your pool build, right? Like your deck, where your deck would go. Because this just gives you the best idea of where you want to bring your pool or where your draws into certain colors are. I would then, and this is a little bit like a sorting tip, bring all of your artifacts that are actually colored, like your mutts, your cohorts, all your unearthed cards, into the colored slots. Because it can get a little bit daunting, because the way Sealed Deck and Arena organizes, I think, is just puts into one big artifact pile. Bring them into the correct color. Makes it a lot easier to lay it out. Bring your fixing into a pile too. Look how many refractors you have, how many evolving wilds you have, how many of the stars, the Elsewhere flasks, all these cards. It's good to take note of that. And then filter by color. Or I guess filtering by color is maybe a previous step if the artifact dragging is a other step. But filter by color in your non-main part of the pool, like the sideboard basically, so you know what you're working with. So what you're going to be looking at that point is you have your main deck where you're building your final deck goes with all your great cards. And then what I would do is sort that part by color and go, okay, what are my deepest colors for the good cards? Well, most of my good cards are white and black. Let's see if I can build a white and black base. And then you look at your sideboard portion of the pool, see what the kind of filler-y good cards are, see if you have enough cards to support that. And then you kind of just go from there, right? And then as you're finishing out the pool, you kind of go, okay, well, I can splash this red card, I can splash this black card. That's the most streamlined way to do it. And this is the way that just, again, shows you what your best cards are. You don't have to go, well, is my red good? Is my green good? You don't have to go through that whole thing. You just bring your good cards in, and that will naturally lead you that way. Okay, so just to finish this out here, I've got a short list of cards that do get better in sealed. So I've talked about a lot of them so far. There's not too many, honestly. I think this is actually kind of light on cards that are like, skyrocket in sealed, where they're not so good in draft. Most of the ones that we're going to touch on are just like the ones I've already covered: the card draw, the flyers, the interaction, the hand disruption, the counter spells. So Dream of Steel and Oil, which is the 1 mana uncommon sorcery that's a hand disruption spell. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an artifact or a creature from it. They exile that card, and you also exile something from their grave. This is a good card. It's very similar to Gix's Caress. I think it's a little bit worse than Gix's Caress because I do really value the Power Stone, giving giving you additional resource, ramping you a little bit. But perfectly solid playable. It's not like, oh man, I've got a dream. That's awesome. I get to play black. No, but it is a good filler card. We're in draft. It's like, you would prefer not to play this. Moving on to some counter spells. Like I said, Urza's Rebuff, 1 blue, counter spell, just a good card. I would actually shy away from Scatter Ray though. So this is the 1 in a blue instant counter target artifact or creature, unless its controller pays 4. Because the games go long, this gets blanked a little bit too quickly. It's okay if you need to play this as like your 23rd playable, but it's not in the tier of, this gets, goes from bad in draft to actively good in sealed. it goes from bad in draft to like a playable if you need it in sealed, which I guess it is kind of that in draft too. So it basically doesn't move. I just want to shout this out as, yeah, don't consider this in the same tier as Urza's Rebuff. I'm not trying to say Urza's Rebuff is an amazing card either. I'm just trying to, just trying to say it goes up a little bit, not a ton. And then, like I said, the artifact enchantment removal spells like Shoot Down, Raise the Ground, these all do get a little bit better. And also, there's a lot of cards on the artifact sheet that, once again, are a little bit too slow for draft. Maybe not perfect for your draft decks, but do get a lot better in sealed. So, Keening Stone, which is the 6-mana artifact, 5-tap, target player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards in their graveyard. I've played this card in my draft decks, in my slower draft decks, and it's okay, but it goes to just like, from okay to a bomb in sealed. This is just going to be one of your best cards you can open. As long as you have somewhat of a defensive deck, this card is going to win a lot of games. Your opponent doesn't have a removal spell and the board is somewhat stalled out. They're just gonna lose to this. It's a very, very clean winning condition. Altar of Dementia, very similar card, right? 2-mana artifact, sack a creature, target player mills cards equals the sacrifice creature's power. Another excellent card that your opponent's just gonna lose to if they can't answer, because the boards do get stalled out a little bit. So yeah, that is, pretty straightforward. Like I said, Brothers War is not that complicated of a sealed format, in my opinion. I think a lot of the stuff I touched on is pretty fundamental to what sealed formats are about, with a few twists in there. I'm going to send it over to Twitch chat if you have any questions, any clarifications you want me to answer, anything that I didn't cover, feel free. And yeah, we'll do a little bit of a Q&A. So Twitch chat. Really good question. So in a bomb-heavy format like this, what if you don't open bombs? What do you do? So my go-to answer when you don't open bombs, it's twofold. One, see if you got that good aggro deck in your pool. Certainly that's an option. I think a little bit too often, though, people do default to, well, I don't have bombs, let's try to go under them. And that works sometimes, but a bad aggro deck where you don't have enough of the twos, like the good twos, is worse than a bad mid-range deck in sealed. There is this idea that, if you don't have the bombs, you just want to play aggro so you can get under your opponent. But the thing is, because your opponents are typically going to have more removal on average, aggro actually, like bad aggro, tends to get brickwalled even easier than it does in draft. So that wouldn't actually be my advice. And if you do have the good aggro deck, which, when I say a good aggro deck, I mean really good curve, you're aiming to look like a draft deck. And that's how you know you have a good aggro deck. If you look like a draft deck or very close to, that's what I would qualify as that. So that's an option. But if you don't have a good aggro deck and don't have bombs, my go-to advice in sealed is just play as many big things or flyers as you possibly can. Tax your opponent's removal. Like, play enough things that your opponent has to answer. Because the worst thing you can do in your sealed deck is play a bunch of cards that your opponent doesn't care about. Play your prototype creatures. Like, this is where the prototypes come in. If all you have for good top end is your prototype creatures, great. That your opponent's gonna have to answer these cards. They can't just ignore them. If you just have a bunch of Koilos rocks, a bunch of flyers, yeah. Like, that's what you want to do, too. And it's very rare that your pool doesn't have some silver lining, right? It's often going to have either good removal or the good creatures, and you can often supplement, like, bad or, like, expensive clunky creatures or, like, expensive clunky flyers with good interaction. And one thing I will say, too, that I think I brought up on a previous sealed episode, but I think it's good to bring up again. This is a quote from Reed Duke, and Reed said, "You don't need anything special to win in sealed." I mean, you don't need anything special to win in a game of Magic in general, aside from good fundamentals. But a good curve, good interaction, good creatures. Yes, you'd love to have the bombs, but it's not necessary. There's a reason the really good players consistently do well in sealed events, and it's not because they always open bombs, right? As much as I joke about streamer luck. Do your games end by decking often? More often than in draft, yes, but I wouldn't say often. No, I do think most of the time somebody ends the game somehow, either through they land their bomb and they stick it and doesn't get answered, or one person outcards the other person or outspends them on mana. So yeah, you have to consider it, but I wouldn't really make too many concessions to it. I guess in game you could be like, okay, like take account of how close you are to decking a little bit earlier than you would in draft, but it's not a huge thing, I don't think. Have you noticed any particular color combinations performing significantly better or worse in sealed? No, so the tricky thing about that, and this is why I think stats, when you're looking at 17 lands and like, well, there's actually a lot of things I think wrong with looking at stats on 17 lands for sealed. One, the general player base for sealed is not particularly experienced. Normally sealed is one of the earliest forms of limited people play, so you do find a lot of really new players there. So then again, a lot of people that are very, very new won't have data for 17 lands. At the same time, though, people that do have 17 lands installed, they're going to be facing those players, and so the data gets a little bit skewed there. So I wouldn't look at the 17 land data with much more than a grain of salt. As far as color combinations go, it's really hard to say, because unlike in draft, where it's a bit more of a repeatable experience, in sealed, it's just like, you know, your pool could be anything. There's a wider variety of pools and decks you're going to be building. So I would say that black decks, I've played black a decent amount just because black has some pretty good interaction. Not as a main color, funny enough, because I don't think its creatures are very good, but I do find I play black a decent amount. I find I play green a decent amount, just because it has like pretty good mana sinks, pretty good late game, decent interaction. Some of the really good bombs are in green. Color combinations in general, though, no, I don't think so. And I also don't think it's that important to be thinking about that, right? Because I don't think it's like, oh, black, red. Like if I just told you, oh, black, red is a good color combination in sealed, you shouldn't build black, red because I say that. You should build what the best pool in your deck is, or what the best deck in your pool, sorry. What the best deck in your pool is. And maybe that is black, red, and you're like, oh, great, awesome, I get that confirmation. But like, no, I don't think any color is that much better than the others, and it really just is dependent on what you open. Is Jayloom Tome too slow? So this is I think it's 3 mana to play, 2 mana to tap, draw a card, and loot. Generally, yes, but I could see playing it if you're super low on ways to, like, use your mana. Like, if you so a good rule of thumb is, if you're short on any of those things, those important things I mentioned, bombs, removal, ways to spend your mana, you can stoop down a little bit lower than you normally would. Like, I just mentioned, if you don't have bombs, play, as many flyers and big prototype things as you can. That's like you're stooping down when you don't have the quality creatures. With the removal spells, it's like, okay, maybe you don't have overwhelming remorses and just like things that straight up exile or kill things, but then maybe you've got like Weakstone Subjugations, and you've got the next tier down of interaction. You're pretty happy to play that. Those are draws into those colors if you don't have the better stuff. So if you don't have ways to spend your mana into the late game and the mid game, yeah, I could see playing Jayloom Tome. I still would be kind of a little bit hesitant hesitant towards it, and I imagine there's most pools won't have to, because there's just like enough stuff to do with your mana in this format. But I can imagine a deck where it's right to do so, yeah. Okay, so I mentioned this before at the beginning of this episode, but I think it is good to just like cover it and put a button on it. People are asking, do you play 3 colors? Do you play 2 colors? Do you play 4 colors? Like what? It depends on the pool. It really does. If you have a streamlined deck that has all good cards in 2 colors, you can play 2 colors. There's nothing wrong with that. If you don't, you're going to be splashing a little more. If you've got bombs in other colors that aren't in your main colors, yeah, you're going to be splashing a little bit. So there's not any like, oh, you're going to be this most often. It really depends on your pool. Again, this goes back to sealed pools are very varied, and they are no 2 sealed pools are the same. It's going to depend on the needs of your pool. And yeah, 2 color decks exist. 4 color, 5 color decks exist too. The tools are there for both. It really just depends on how much good stuff you have in your base 2 colors. Because if you have a base 2 color deck that isn't splashing at all, and it's not playing any bad cards, it's got removal, it's got ways to spend its mana, it's got bombs, great. You've got an advantage on everybody else because you don't need to splash. But if you do not have those things, you should splash. And it's not that big of a cost to splash. But, it is ideal, I think, to play a 2-color deck that just has excellent cards. What about slow engines like Altar plus Clay Revenant? So this is the 3-mana Altar that sacrifices the creature to make a 3/3 golem, and Clay Revenant's the 1/2 that enters tapped, and you can buy it back for 3 mana. Yeah, it's a similar thing to Jayloom Tome, where if I needed an engine, and if I needed a place to put my mana, my good cards didn't naturally do that. Yeah, I would do that. I would put some sort of engine so I can spend my mana into the late game. I think that engine's a little bit better than Jayloom Tome. It actually, gives you a material advantage rather than just looting. And also, there are definitely decks where Clay Revenant is just a playable. You've got some of the spiders, right? Or you've got other things that you want to sacrifice where it's just like not the worst card in your deck. Again, I would caution against putting that card in your deck in general, because it's low impact. It's like this trinkety piece that is very highly synergistic. But I can't imagine pools that have like 6-7 ways to sacrifice it for value that you do think that's like, you would consider that a fine playable. But that is the kind of card, as a good example, like, don't get too cute with your synergies. Like, if you have a Power Stone Fracture and like one Spider, you don't have to play Clay Revenant. You can just sacrifice your Power Stones or like a dorky creature that's sitting around. You really, really want all of your cards to have a place in your deck, fill some sort of role, make sure they're not bad cards on their own. How about cards like Springleaf Drum and Sentinel Stalwart as fixing? Yeah, totally. Those are good fixing. I will note, so Springleaf Drum, which is a 1-mana artifact that you tap a creature to add a mana of any color, that's a card I think is very underrated. Actually, I think the Druid is actually really underrated too, the Sentinel Stalwart. Both those cards are quite underrated right now in the draft format, and so I think people are going to undervalue them when they're looking at their sealed pool. The trick with Drum is that you want to replace a land with Drum. Like, land is, Drum is a mana source. It's kind of a bad Moxen, if you want to look at it that way. And to be able to play that card, just like to be able to play the Stalwart, you want to have a lot of 1s and 2s and 3s, so that you're actually making mana off of it quickly. Like, if you have a bunch of 2-drops and the Drum is basically just a land that makes any color. Yes, you have to tap a creature as a cost, but that's often not that big of a cost, and if you're splashing multiple colors, it pulls a lot of weight. Same with the Druid, with the Sentinel Stalwart. That's a card that, if you've got a lot of cheap stuff, that you can count that as a land some amount of the time, as long as you're base green. Now, you don't want to count like 3 of them as 3 lands, certainly, but you can shave on a land. I think those cards are underperforming on 17 lands currently, but I believe that is because people, 1, probably aren't replacing a land with them a lot of the time, and 2, I think they might just be throwing them in decks that don't belong. Like, I think you actively want those cards to have a pretty low curve, stuff to do with your mana after, mana sinks, and also, ideally, those cards are pulling a lot of weight and they're making multiple colors. So you have a bunch of unearthed costs that you're using those to pay for, of different colors, like a green a green one, a white one, and a blue one. Those help you enable all those things. And I guess another point on top of this is, one of my points was spending all your mana, or spending as much mana as you can in the mid game. If you can unlock some unearthed costs that you normally wouldn't have access to, the Springleaf Drum and the Druid actually let you spend more mana than you would otherwise, right? Because they let you unlock your unearthed costs, which is actually just like a really big upgrade for not being able to do that. Is there a such thing as too much removal? Yeah. So, yes, as much as I was saying, play removal spells, those are big draws into your colors, you do run the risk sometimes of having like 13 removal spells and no action, no ways to close the game. Like, as much as it is a very good thing to have a lot of removal spells and it's critical, you also really want to have good ways to close the game. And so if your removal spells are cutting into your counts of 14, 15, maybe that's a little bit high even, but like, if you've got 12 interaction spells and 10 creatures, a lot of those creatures aren't going to be game-winning creatures. They're going to be kind of filling out the curve along 2, 3, 4, right? So I want probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 creatures that are beefy, can, tussle in the late game. So yeah, you do run into that risk a little bit. I would say I'd want to max out on 10 removal spells and then have 13 creatures that are high impact and close at the game. You don't want to run into the situation where your opponent also has a lot of removal spells and you just lose the game because you can't close it out. It is equally important in Sealed to be able to pressure your opponent as it is to answer your opponent's cards, and so you do want to have that balance. All right, chat, I'm going to pack up. Thanks for hanging out. Good luck for everybody this weekend. Hope you all open the colorless bombs out there, the worm coils, the portals, and the cityscape levelers. I'm going to pack up. The coming weeks, I've got a few things planned on the old content docket, a few guests that I'm possibly lining up, some level ups that I've been wanting to touch on for a little while, and I think I'm definitely going to be touching on Bro still. I think this is a really deep format. I've got a lot to say about it, so stay tuned, and see you next time.